So far we've reviewed the 9300 leaf switches, but now we want to take a look at the 9300 spine switches. Cisco did create some fixed configuration spine switches that can go into smaller data centers. By the end of this nugget, we'll not only be able to tell the difference between the different models that Cisco has in the 9300 spine switches, but we'll also know why we should pick maybe a 9500 over a 9300 in larger data centers in certain situations. We're going to head on over to Cisco's website and take a look at the datasheet that they have for the fixed spine switches. And if we're having problems finding this on Cisco's website, we can always just Google 9300 fixed spine switches datasheet. That should get us to the right page. So let's scroll down and take a look at the different switch models we have. And we're looking at two different models. We have the 9364C and the 9332C. Now remember from our conversation around how Cisco names their switches that the C is equivalent to saying we have 100 gig on these switches. And when we only have two numbers, this is a minor point that we covered, but when we say 9364, that 64 not only refers to the bandwidth as being 6.4 terabits per second, but also has 64 ports, which is exactly what we see here with both switches, really. So the 9364 has 64 ports at 100 gig, and guess what? That can operate at line rate. That means that we can have every single interface going 100 gig inbound and 100 gig outbound going at the same time without dropping a single frame. That's incredible. Likewise, the 9332 can do 32 ports at 100 gig and also at line rate. So we have two different options here just depending on the size of switch that we need. Now, two other things. First of all, both of these switches have two fixed config 1 and 10 gig SFP+. So they're right over here on the left. We can see those there, and right over here on the 9332. So we have that on both switches. Second of all, there are some interfaces that are marked. You can kind of see them here. They're sort of green-yellow. And these interfaces on these two switches are capable of supporting what we call MACsec encryption, which we've mentioned a few different times. But what that essentially does is between two switches that support MACsec, the communications between those two switches on those specifically on those interfaces, that will be encrypted between the two switches. So not end-to-end encryption, again, it's just point-to-point between the two switches that support MACsec encryption. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, holy smokes, 32 and even 64 ports on a 9300 spine, why would I ever go with a 9500 spine switch when we think about it, every leaf switch has one interface up to a spine switch. And so we do that math in reverse and we say a 64 port spine switch can support 64 ACI leaf nodes. And that's a very large network. So do we really have to have, the need to have 65 ACI leaf switches just to have motivation to go to a Nexus 9500? And there actually are a couple of caveats we want to be careful of if we're going to deploy 9300s as our spine switches. And in order to see those caveats, we only need to scroll down a little bit to the section on performance and scalability. And right here we can see a couple of limitations. So first of all, we look at the amount of routes that we can have in the routing table. So 96,000 routes, and also the number of MAC addresses. And this could really come back to bite some data centers. 92,000 MAC addresses can sound like a lot for smaller environments, but for cloud hosting environments, as well as larger enterprise networks, we can quickly exhaust the 92,000 MAC addresses if we're not careful. We can also see another limitation here with the number of multicast routes supported. And really, if we continue to scroll down the performance and scalability section, we're going to find that the 9300s are perfect for smaller infrastructures that don't need the cloud scale approach to its resource tables. But again, for those cloud enterprise or just larger environments, we're going to want to be really careful around these resource limitations that are in the 9300s. Now, in order to contrast the 9300s to the 9500s, let's just pop over here to the 9500 Cloud Scale Line Card datasheet, and we'll scroll down to the same section that talks about the scalability. Now, keep in mind that the 9732C-EX and the 9736C-FX, these are our spine switches. So right away we can see that, while the number of MAC addresses, holy smokes, we've got 512K compared to the 92 that we had on the 9300s. And that's per line card. So we can throw multiple line cards into a single 9500 chassis and really scale up the MAC addresses that are supported. Same with multicast routes. We saw 8,000 before. Now we're up to 32,000, again, per line card. We can support up to 1 million IPv4 routes. I mean, we can just scroll up and down here and see that the scalability on 9500s is a lot better than the 9300s. So when sizing out a new ACI infrastructure, it's not usually the port density that's the driving factor for determining whether we should go with a 9300 or 9500 spine. Usually it's the performance and scalability limits of the different platforms. There are two different models of the 9300 spine switches, the 9332C and the 9364C. Both switches support 100 gig on all of its interfaces at line rate, and both have certain interfaces that will support MACsec encryption. Now, in keeping in mind, when we're designing an ACI environment, we really don't want to necessarily look at the port density first. It's more about the resource limitations that the 9300s have versus the more scalable 9500s might have, even though we might be able to support all of our spines or leaf switches on one of the 9300 spine switches. There's still reasons to look at the 9500s as we saw. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.